Hi, Acadiana. Meteorologist Dave Baker here. It is noon on a Friday. Hopefully you've had a decent week so far. We're going to be doing Let's Talk Tropics here. Just playing with that countdown. Didn't know what was going to happen when it got to zero, but so you got to see a few extra graphics here on the latter part of the show. Let's go ahead and get started. It is going to be somewhat of a shorter version. It is a rainy Friday afternoon here in Lafayette and all over Acadiana. So far, we've been pretty lucky that everything has stayed below the severe weather threshold, but it looks like we'll probably see thunderstorms kind of on and off through the day and more coming up perhaps later this evening. So let's go ahead and jump right in. It's really a fairly quiet start to the day when it comes to tropical weather, and hurricane season officially begins tomorrow and will last through November the 30th. And so far, we've seen pretty normal conditions all across the Atlantic basin, with the exception of our water temperatures. This is the global map here that shows the water temperatures, and they're quite a bit above normal here across much of the tropical Atlantic. And then we've got waters that are starting to cool down a little bit here, which is that sign of La Nina making a return. If you don't know what El Nino and La Nina is, El Nino is when the waters off the South American coast are warmer than average, and you go into a La Nina pattern when they're cooler than average. And La Nina patterns also tend to bring a bit more tropical development over the Atlantic basin by lightening some of the trade winds and the shear. So as tropical systems are just starting to get going, they have a better chance. We've got way above normal temperatures here in the Western Gulf, also here right around the Florida Peninsula, and even in the development zone that's way out off the African coast. Normally we don't look that far out this early in the season, but there have been a couple of significant tropical waves moving off. Again, nothing unusual about that, but because those water temperatures are so warm, some of those tropical waves coming off the African coast already seem to be holding on a little bit more, as normally they would reach those colder waters and just kind of get sheared apart, torn apart. So there's a look at the water temperatures in our local neighborhood when we're talking about the Western Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Caribbean Sea. And earlier this week, we were looking at some temperatures that were getting close to 90 here. Looks like we've got some upper 80s there across portions of South Florida, and then the western part of the Atlantic Ocean has also been seeing, or rather the Gulf has been seeing some of these water temperatures well into the 80s as well. So it does appear that if anything were to develop and the atmospheric conditions were good, the water temperatures would definitely be able to sustain any tropical development. So let's just briefly look over the entire hurricane season and what we normally expect. June is relatively quiet, although sometimes we get one or two named tropical storms during the month of June. And then occasionally July, just for some reason, tends to drop off on the activity, and then it really ramps up into August. And then, of course, the peak of the hurricane season is September the 10th. And that's when we see the bulk of all of our tropical storms and hurricanes, right about there. So early in the season, we don't get super concerned about our tropical activity, but really our eyes are peeled once we get into August. So let's look at the June development again. And this is basically at the beginning of the hurricane season. The areas that are shaded in red are where most of our tropical systems are born, and then the arrows indicate the general movement of any developed tropical system and where it would possibly go. So the western Gulf of Mexico, including the Bay of Campeche, also the western Caribbean, particularly there between Belize and Jamaica, because if something develops there, you tend to get something that tries to work its way right up into portions of the Gulf of Mexico through the Yucatan Channel. So those two areas are what our primary concern is, and sometimes the southwestern Caribbean, and also sometimes areas from the Bahamas over toward the Virgin Islands. Occasionally you get some of these tropical waves moving off toward the west, and they'll bring some heavy rains to Florida, and occasionally they can develop as they move into the Gulf of Mexico. So let's go ahead and start with the Gulf of Mexico. Again, it really is a fine day out there, with the exception of the northern Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. And we can see that here in Lafayette and much of Acadiana. Most of you are probably experiencing some rain out there, but our offshore friends are getting a windy and rainy day as well, and we had some pretty big thunderstorms develop. Most of the action has basically been from Vermilion Bay, and then off toward the west we've seen those heavier rains. So that's the general area, but in the development zones, especially out here over the Bay of Campeche, there's really nothing going on. The Yucatan Channel is relatively clear. You might see some of that milky color there over the Bay of Campeche. A lot of that is some smoke from some agricultural fires that are coming out of Central America and northern Mexico. Meanwhile, we're looking at the Caribbean here, really the entire Atlantic Ocean. We've got a number of tropical waves that are out there, and as I said earlier, it's not unusual to have these tropical waves. You've got one right about there. You got one kind of crossing over the central part of the Atlantic. Boy, I really don't like this telestrator. We had another one that was moving through the Windward Islands, but that's still producing some thunderstorms there over northern Venezuela. And then yesterday we talked a lot more about this tropical wave that was moving across portions of Central America that did have a bit of a flare-up of the thunderstorm activity, and in an area where we have some particularly low wind shear. Now, a couple of things that are happening here. You got a lot of wind shear that's way up here at the top. You've got the wind shear, and the low pressure area and the trough was right over here, kind of over the extreme southwestern portion of the Caribbean Sea. But as it moves to the west, it's interacting with land here, and so because of that, we're probably not going to be seeing any development. Some of the action is going to be moving over into the Pacific Ocean, but some of this is going to get caught up and kind of slide off toward the northeast and bring some heavier downpours to portions of Jamaica and Cuba. So this is an area that we tend to watch during the early part of the season, but at least at this point in time, I don't think we're going to see any tropical development there. And the other tropical wave that we were looking at over the middle part of the Caribbean Sea really isn't showing any signs of organization. It's just kind of bringing some showers and thunderstorms here along the northern coast of Venezuela and also getting into Colombia as well. And then you can see some of that moisture here is starting to get picked up from that tropical wave, and that's going to be pulled into the northern part of the Caribbean, Jamaica, Haiti, over toward Cuba, and into the Bahamas. So again, most of this is just kind of steering clear of the Gulf of Mexico, which is good news. So let's talk a little bit about the wind shear map here. And remember, we talked that developing tropical systems need low wind shear in order to survive, because if you get these winds at different levels, as let's say a tropical storm is trying to develop, it wants to have a nice, cleanly stacked center of circulation, straight up and straight down. If you think about those big hurricanes that are Category 4 or Category 5 that have a very defined eye, and when you look at those satellite images, you can see right down to the ocean, that's a good vertically stacked tropical system. And when we have that, you have an efficient running engine, and it can strengthen or at the very least maintain itself. But when you've got all of this wind shear that's out here, different levels where the circulation would be could be offset. So let's just, for example, let's say you had a low pressure here at the surface, but because of the wind shear, the mid-center, the middle part of that, mid-level, the center might be over here or might be over here. So you got a very disorganized type of a system. So right now, because of all of the wind shear that's out there, there's really not a very good chance for anything to develop at this time. Tropical cyclone heat potential for today is still looking quite high. Again, as we explained yesterday, if we were seeing some kind of a tropical system possibly in this area south of, let's say, the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and we knew it was going to be moving in this general direction, we'd be more concerned because of that tropical cyclone heat potential. And what we do is we look at temperatures at the surface. If they're over 80 degrees, we know it can sustain a tropical system. But the TCHP kind of shows how deep those warmer waters go. So if a tropical cyclone moves over that area, they do tend to churn up the seas, and sometimes it can bring some colder water that's a little bit farther down below the surface. When you've got a tremendous amount of hot water that goes pretty deep as well, then that doesn't really affect a developing tropical system. So anything that would be developing or moving across the western part of the Caribbean or the Yucatan Channel, or even the extreme southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, we would be concerned if the upper level or the atmospheric conditions around that were okay, because that could be the case where we would see some rapid intensification. So fortunately right now, we don't see any of that. So again, we just kind of sometimes like to peek into La La Land here. This is the GFS extended model, and it kind of just, rather than giving us an idea of where new tropical systems would develop, even maybe 2 weeks out, really these are taking their best guess once they get out beyond 3 or 4 days. But it's always good to look at the trends, and we've got a big ridge of high pressure that's there over the central part of the Atlantic. That isn't going to be moving, so tropical waves coming off the Atlantic coast will just continue to steer their way westward toward the Windward and Leeward Islands, but really not seeing anything in the GFS extended model. That doesn't mean that we couldn't get anything to develop in the next 2.5 weeks, but right now that just doesn't seem to be very likely, so the National Hurricane Center is not expecting any tropical cyclone activity for the next several days. But do keep in mind that we are now heading into hurricane season starting tomorrow. A good idea for this time of the year is making sure you're taking inventory of the supplies that you have and the supplies that you need while everything is plentiful at the stores. Many of you probably were taking inventory after the severe weather over the last couple of weeks. I know we did. We knew we could find a couple of flashlights. We know we have more. We just don't know exactly where they've gone throughout the house. And we were a little short on batteries, and at the same time, our cell phones weren't necessarily supercharged when we lost electricity a couple of weeks ago with that big windstorm that came through on a Monday here in Lafayette. So we're taking inventory as well, and just getting ourselves prepared. And of course, there's another way as you get about a week out from something threatening, and then you also have another set of plans when you're just getting 2 or 3 days out from a landfall. So do keep that in mind and make sure you put your plan together. GetagamePlan.org is a great website to go visit. There's a lot of really good tips and lists of supplies that you would need, which does make it a little bit easier and helps you put together a plan so that you will be safe during hurricane season. So again, this is kind of a shorter version of Let's Talk Tropics, as I'm kind of watching the radar on the other side with my other eye here, and we've got the heavy rains that are out there. If you like this video, please click the like button and also subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you know when the next Let's Talk Tropics will drop, or Acadiana Weather Today that we do weekday mornings between 7:30 and 8. And there is still a possibility we may go into severe weather mode later on. Usually we'll run a stream that's got a rotating set of radars or any other weather information that will be there. You can always find that on Acadiana Weather Today's YouTube page. For those of you who click on this and run through Facebook, I'll tell you, you'll get a way better experience if you click that button that's at the top of the video where it says Open in App. Or if you use your smart TV, you can always pull up these streams there as well. Again, with that severe weather, if you got those notifications turned on, you'll get the alert if we go into severe weather mode later on. For now, I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. To tell you the truth, I'm really hoping that I don't see you for the rest of the weekend because of any weather out there. But if we do, we will break in live right away. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.